Welcome to another episode of the Gritty Hour. My usual cohort and co-host, Sean E. Boy, has the week off, and I have a very special guest this week, Dr. Gil Perrone, who's a dental surgeon, works out of Manhattan, I believe Central Park West, and
Correct.
also a pretty extensive collector of militaria. So we're going to talk about both things today. And welcome to the Gritty Hour, Doctor.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me. My
Yeah,
pleasure.
it's a pleasure to have you. And so you are a dental surgeon?
That's correct. Oral surgeon, oral maxillofacial surgeon. I practice on Central Park West, Upper West Side, Manhattan. I've been here 38 years. Time flies.
Yeah, I know. Yeah. And Central Park West, you must see a lot of famous people down there, I'm thinking.
Correct. Yeah. If you're anything worth your salt, being in Manhattan, you rub elbows, you have patients. I have professional athletes. I have TV personalities, movie personalities, some of the most famous rappers in the world. It's been fun. It's yes, they're here. Manhattan is a big hub for the entertainment and sports world, and I've been fortunate, to be able to treat these people. And there are some perks. I get concert tickets, I get sports tickets. So it's been a
Is
good
it all
one
right if I
so
put a
far.
link to your website and your phone number on the show notes of this podcast?
Sure, absolutely.
And somebody can reach out to you, especially people that are in Manhattan, could reach out to
Yeah,
you.
be happy.
Yeah.
I can give you my phone number right now. I can give you
Yeah. Let it rip.
all right, 212-496-6343. And the email, probably the best way to contact the office, WSOMFS@AOL.com. It stands for West Side Oral Maxillofacial Surgery.
Okay. Well, we'll also have a link to both just below. If you're looking at us on YouTube, it'll be just below the video. It'll also be in the show notes if you're listening to us on Apple or Spotify or Google or wherever you listen to our podcast. So how long you been down there in Central Park West?
Well, I've been here since '84. I
Mhm.
did I went to dental school in Scotland, which was a tremendous experience. And I came back and did a 5-year residency on the Upper West Side at what used to be St. Luke's Hospital. Now it's part of Mount Sinai West. Opened my practice in '82, a few blocks from here. 2 years later, I was fortunate. The office really took off. The practice took off. So I had two business partners, and we opened this office on Central Park West in 1984. We've been here ever since. There's two of us now, one retired. And again, it's a great location. As we said before, I have just down the street some of the most famous personalities you'll see on stage and screen. And again, just being in the area, if you do the right thing, you build up a good reputation, you treat everybody right, you will see people that have some sort of history behind them. So
Yeah.
it's been fun.
Well, I know because of the HIPAA laws, you can't say their names, but I'm pretty sure anybody listening or watching us would know these people if you could say their names.
Absolutely. If you think of probably arguably the number one rapper and his wife in the world, um, some of the New York Knicks, I've seen the New York Mets. I mean, we're here. I mean, I'm just right down the street from the Garden, basically. Jump on the subway, a couple of stops, and I go to a lot of Knick games. Let's say.
That's good for you. Yeah, it's good to have perks.
Exactly.
Yeah. So being in that practice, I'm sure the practice is a success, obviously. It may have
Correct.
afforded you to, because I know you as a collector of militaria, and I know you have a very extensive collection of militaria. And I'm just curious how you got into it in the first place.
Well, when I was 10, my parents took me to Gettysburg on
Yeah.
a vacations, a couple of day vacation. And I was fascinated even at 10. I think I always had a calling towards not only military history, but weapons in general, the evolution of firearms, in the role they've played in world history. And also, I have pieces of my collection that are literally pieces of art. ivory handles, silver inlays, gold inlays. So back in the day, the weapons were quite ornate and functional. But I bought my first artifact when I was 10. My mother bought it for me, a Civil War bullet, which I found out 20 years later was actually a replica. It wasn't even real,
Oh,
but I didn't know and I didn't care. And my career, my training kept me from really throwing myself in fully into the collecting world because, 4 years of college, 4 years of dental school, 5 years of residency, 5 years to build a practice. So I was in my late 30s, and when I had the means then in the late 1980s to start acquiring the pieces I've always desired for. I still have my first Civil War musket. I still have my first Civil War handgun, and I still have that bullet that I bought from Gettysburg in 1960.
yeah. Well, that's
But
that's an emotional keepsake. See.
oh, absolutely, it's priceless.
Yeah.
And I've been fortunate. I've worked at it. I've in the day I'd go to tag sales. I've gone to more auctions than you could count. Uh, Before the internet, I would drive to New Hampshire and Maine, where if you went to an auction, it was just the people in the room. So it wasn't you competing with the world to buy an item.
Yeah.
And there were days I literally filled up my Forerunner with merchandise. And that's how I built my collection. And it just took off from there. Then I sort of got known in the collecting fraternity. People would call me with collections or items. I have a pretty good memory of what I do, a lot of reading of, well, not only military history, but the weapons involved. And I even have dealers across the country who call me for some advice or what my thoughts are on a certain piece. And when I retire, I'll probably travel to, shows across the country, which I enjoy. I like spending, I've done it on a very small scale, spend the weekend, you know, buy, sell, talk to people. You always have something to learn, something to gain. And it's a nice distraction. So, I enjoy that camaraderie. Um, it's somewhat of an investment, I guess. My collection has certainly grown in value, but I think of it more as a real hobby. You don't think of it as a monetary, although you can do well if you buy right and then sell. But I just love the history behind the pieces. I've been fortunate. I've been able to evolve. Most of what I collect now is identified. Like pretty much most of my swords now have history of either someone being killed, captured, or wounded. So that's, to me, very exciting to hold something that was in a battle, because the inscribed pieces have dates and presentations on them. And it almost talks to you.
Do you do you
Um,
do you feel like your main focus in the collecting world is Civil War era?
yeah, it always has been from the get go because I've been fascinated with the Civil War itself. It changed the country,
Hmm.
everything from our vernacular to phraseology. It really was a major turning point for the country. And so I still am very partial to that. I have expanded. Of late, I've been uh, doing more Revolutionary War uh, collecting. And as I had five uncles that fought in World War II and one in Korea, and one of my uncles had no children, he left me his bringbacks from the Pacific Theater. The last 10 years or so, I've actually expanded also into World War One and World War II. And the advantage of that collecting is I shoot most of those pieces that I have acquired. The German Lugers, the World War II Garands, the carbines, the German rifles, Japanese rifles. It's something which I don't recommend someone doing unless you're really knowledgeable and have the items checked out before you put a shell in it, a cartridge in it. But I do a lot of shooting indoors, outdoors with weapons that have been used in the First and Second World War. So the
Hmm.
last 10 years, I've sort of like expanded or divested out. And, but my primary focus still is Civil War.
Yeah,
If probably,
you and I have that in common. I'm sort of a Civil War buff. I hate that term, but I have sort of an insatiable proclivity to learn more about the Civil War. I can never get enough of it. And I've been to Gettysburg 20 plus times, as Antietam, Fredericksburg. Do you go to those battlefields at all? I know you've
I'll
been
be
to
at Gettysburg this
Wow.
weekend, ironically. I'm going to a gun show in Allentown on Saturday and then driving down to Gettysburg for the night, spend the morning and come back home on Sunday with a couple of friends. My oldest son went to Gettysburg College, nothing to do with me and my collecting or my obsession
Maybe
with this.
subliminally, you never know.
Maybe.
Yeah.
And, but yes, I've been to the battlefields. And again, like yourself, I'm sort of obsessed. I do a lot of reading. Again, one of my fascinations is the evolution of the weapons. Like the Civil War also changed warfare. We went from fighting Napoleonic type tactics where you just lined up across from each other and fired, and two people went down on each side. The weapons in the Civil War became much more deadly, much more efficient, rifled, repeating rifles, the Gatling gun, which I happen to own one.
Just because rumor has it that you own a Gatling gun, but that was like 18. What was the year of that Gatling gun that you owned?
Well, it's a hopper feed. It's European. It's not one of the ones that you see that really are like the desirable Colts from the Indian Wars. Mine probably 1862, so Civil War era.
Oh, it is.
It's a
Okay.
hopper, yeah, a hopper feed, meaning there's a big donut drum. The shells just drop down into the chamber, and you crank it, and you get 300 to 600 rounds a minute.
Wow.
And they did have them in the Civil War. They didn't really use them. They used them to guard prisoners. Again, historically, nothing changes. The government was always cost conscious. They didn't like the Gatling guns because they're too expensive, because you're shooting 600 rounds a minute and bullets cost money. And the country was almost bankrupt during the Civil War. And one side note, the Custer era, everybody knows a little bighorn. He had two Gatling guns he left behind, as well as his sabers. And he went prancing off because of his ego. He didn't want to drag the Gatling guns because they slow him down. He didn't want the sabers because they make noise and he'd lose the element of surprise, he thought. So he entered that battle with trapdoor Springfields, which were horrible weapons. Again, another government scandal. Instead of having repeating rifles like the Henry rifle and the Spencer rifle, which are too expensive to operate because the firepower was too great, they sent them off with single shot trapdoors that got jammed after 2 or 3 rounds. And basically his soldiers were fighting with nothing. Maybe revolvers. They had no sabers, guns that were jamming against the Indians that had repeating rifles, etc. So again, it's one of these fascinating sidebars about these.
As you were talking, I was thinking of, can you imagine if they did use it extensively during the Civil War? There was 600,000 casualties on both sides to begin with. Can you imagine if they used the Gatling gun with more regularity?
Yeah, if they both had them, yes, the casualties would have tripled. One side had them, probably the North, because they had the manufacturing capability. The South did not. The war would have ended a lot quicker. But yes, there would have been total, as much carnage as there was, you could just logarithmically extrapolate how many people would have died.
Imagine if they had 1 or 2 at Pickett's Charge on the high watermark there. Forget
Correct.
it. Yeah.
Exactly. They would have never made it to the wall.
Yeah.
But if Custer had them and he put them back to back, he probably would have survived that battle. Just 2 Gatling guns firing 600 rounds a minute.
What year was that Bull Run? It's like
1874. 1876. Custer's battle?
The Bull Run.
Bull Run. You've been talking about.
Sorry, what do you call it? Little Bighorn.
Yeah, 1876.
Yeah. So yeah, you're right. If he had those, he probably would have fared better. But
yeah, he would have probably fared better. He probably could have gotten out of there. But then there wouldn't be all these great stories afterwards.
Did you ever see the movie Gettysburg?
Oh, many times. I have it on CD. I have it on cassette.
It's
actually accurate. As many as these military films are not, Gettysburg is one of the first true depictions of what went on. You
Yeah.
know, it's obviously dramatized in certain aspects, but just like a lot of the World War II movies that are coming out in the last 10 years, much more realistic, much more accurate. Yeah,
Yeah.
that's a great movie. That's a
But
great
the point
Gettysburg's
I
great.
wanted to make was, the story in that movie about Joshua Chamberlain and the 20th Maine being on the left flank of the Union Army, and if they didn't stand their ground, how history would have changed. That's what the thought that came to my mind when you talked about Custer at Little Bighorn, if he had the Gatling guns, but he didn't. So history is what it is because of these things that happened or didn't happen,
That's
but
right.
made me think of Joshua Chamberlain um, not surrendering ground when he was the left flank of the Union Army at the time. Little nuances in battles that can change history.
Oh, absolutely. Just it's amazing what small um, event relative to a 4-year conflict could have changed history. Absolutely. You
Yeah.
know, the first day of Gettysburg, if the Confederates would have pressed the assault that first night up Culp's Hill, they probably would have pushed the Union forces back. They would have gotten behind them, between them and Washington, and could have put surrender papers or right on Lincoln's desk.
Yeah.
Just one general's decision or non-action in
Yeah.
all of these battles.
Was that General
Um,
Howard? Was it? Who was the one that decided Cemetery Hill was a good spot to? Was that General Howard or General? Um, he was the commanding general. He was the first general on the scene that decided to make a stand by the cemetery on Cemetery
yeah,
Hill.
because he's of course now the name escapes me, but his line was, "We have to take the high ground,"
Yeah.
um, and that was a smart decision.
Yeah.
Um, Reynolds, I believe,
Oh, General.
but
Yeah. Well, no, Reynolds was the one that was killed on day one, right?
that's right. Reynolds was killed. You know what? I should know that. Of course, I'm
I
getting
want to
drawing a
say
blank.
General Howard, but I know that's not General
No,
Howard.
it's not Howard.
Was subservient to this other guy, and he was also wounded during Pickett's charge. This guy, Hancock, I believe it was
Hancock.
Hancock who decided that was a good spot, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah,
And
I'm
that,
not honestly. I'm not sure, but that you're what you're saying is true. Just one decision, take that ground and hold it, probably made it set up everything for the next 3 days. And again, if he didn't, they probably would have been overrun that day
yeah,
because
because
they basically were losing the battle the entire day.
yeah, because
And
I was going to say,
then, of course, Pickett's charge was a fiasco, but that was the last day.
yeah, yeah, and it boggles the mind how the little things, sometimes by just one soldier or one small regiment, can change anything. Like the First Minnesota during the Battle of Gettysburg can keep the line. Little nuances in battles is what it always intrigues me, especially in the Civil War. You know, so you have a lot of muskets. Are any of them attributed to the Battle of Gettysburg?
Actually, I have the problem with collecting Civil War, and it's a shame. Like most nowadays, almost any auction site, stuff online, which be very careful about. There's always the title. Oh, was it Gettysburg? Was it Gettysburg? Was it Gettysburg? Most of the stuff is advertised being is not at was never. You just don't know. Like I buy the gun, not the story. I do have an inscribed pistol, Colt pocket pistol, to someone who was at um, the battle, so I know that gun was there. Most likely, it could have been left in his locker, but I have a couple of items that are inscribed to soldiers that were there at the battle. So yes, I have a few, not many. One of the coolest relics I have was dug in 1955, I believe, in the 50s, from the Gettysburg battlefield, and it was dug up and was documented back then. And I acquired it 25, 30 years ago at an auction. And it's a musket, model 1842, that probably was dropped during the battle. But two things about it: the barrel is bent. So a shell had hit the barrel and it's actually at an angle, and the hammer is cocked back. So it was about to be fired. Now, again, a lot of this is supposition, but it probably the soldier that had that was killed or wounded, cocking back the weapon to fire it, and something, whether it was shrapnel, something hit the musket, bent the barrel, and he dropped the musket in the loaded position, cocked back. This thing was buried since the battle and was unearthed in the 50s. I have that on the wall. No wood, the wood is gone, but the butt plate, everything's separate, but the entire musket, the metal is there, including the bayonet and the bent barrel, with pretty much ironclad documentation that was dug at the battlefield. So that's kind of cool. I mean, it's not, well,
Was
the value is
the
arbitrary,
mini
something
ball
like
still in
that,
the
but
barrel?
probably someone said that. Many people that know me that have been to see the collection, and if they really know weapons, they'll say, Gil, there's probably a live charge in there. I can't tell because the barrel is bent. I can't get anything in there to see if I'm hitting the charge. But yes, it could be still loaded.
Wow.
Um, that's why if you ever buy any, um, well, relic or non-relic, any Civil War weapon, or pretty much any weapon, you should check the barrel to make sure it's not loaded, because you could have a gun, and I have more than one over the years, from the Civil War or before or after Mexican War, that there was a charge still in the barrel.
Hmm.
And if you can't get it out, you just pour some oil down there to deactivate it. But that powder can still go off, and it probably just blow the whole breech up. I have a collection of what I call relics. I have about 7 or 8 pistols from the Civil War, dug from certain battlefields, and 2 or 3 are documented enough that I believe that they are there. A lot of them just come with stories that may or may not be true. Most of the pistols that I have, the relics that have been dug from battlefields, have bullets still in them. You can just look at it. You can look at the cylinder, and the bullets are still there. They're loaded. 1 or 2 are cocked back. So again, someone was probably, well, if they're a pistol, probably on horseback, because the cavalry had pistols, um, and dropped it, got knocked off. The gun hit the ground, got buried, unearthed 100 years later, and still loaded. I have several. But if you're thinking of acquiring any of this, don't think it's harmless because it's 100 years old or 50 years old, especially the more modern stuff, the World War II weapons. Um, be very careful that those guns are not loaded, even, anywhere from 70 to 100 years back, because they can go off.
Well,
This stuff is still.
tell us a little bit about what you have from the Revolutionary War. I would think that would be harder to collect just from the year's difference.
Well, it's not only that, we didn't have any armories. So 95%, 98% of Revolutionary War weapons are from France and Germany, well, Germany as well, France and Britain, and Germany is a distant third. The hard thing about Revolutionary War is, since we didn't have armories, there's nothing stamped Springfield Arsenal, Rock Island Arsenal. There, our troops, our soldiers were farmers, they were settlers. They first went to, let me just shut this off, sorry. Um, they first went into battle with the stuff they were foraging with, hunting with. So they just went to war with the stuff that was their musket that was hanging over the fireplace. Matter of fact, when our militia was formed, there were certain rules. Like if you wanted to join the militia pre-Revolutionary War, you have to have had a musket that took a bayonet. So one of my favorite pieces, which I actually got from a patient that brought it into my office, she didn't know what it was. She said, "Oh, I have this old musket. I don't want it." And I had it looked at by George Newman, who's now deceased, who wrote the book on American Revolutionary War items. And he looked at it and he was aghast. He goes, "This is the quintessential French and Indian War / Rev War musket." It was a Fowler. It was a hunting piece from the 1850s, 1750s, 1740s, that someone had broken the fore end off to weld a bayonet lug, because you had to join the American militia. You had to have a rifle that was capable of taking a bayonet. Well, their hunting guns didn't. So they would break the wood off the front, solder a little nipple so they could put a bayonet on. And you also had to have a either a side knife or a sword and a pistol. So there was, you had to be equipped a certain way. So that's how you can tell if you have something that's really early. If you have what was a hunting piece, a Fowler, and the wood in the front has been broken off 200 years ago, and a crudely soldered socket bayonet lug is there, that's one way of telling. But the vast majority, like the Americans were armed by the French. So there are certain models, like the Charleville muskets, the 1763, the 1766. They were sent here in large numbers. And that's one of our primary weapons that our Continental Army was equipped with. So, yeah, it's tricky. It's a good point you made. Revolutionary War weapons, there's broad categories. Like I have Charleville muskets and Charleville pistols, and they're stamped a certain ways. There's certain like letter D's on the lock plate, for example, is a good indication it was exported here. You're not quite sure. It could have never left France, but that's the type of weapon. Now, the British guns, the British Brown Besses that the British Army had, they are regimentally marked in certain cases, and they're they're easier to say, yes, this was issued to the British Army in 1776 or whatever the year was, and came over and fought in our, because depending on the regiment, you could trace the history, which regiments from Britain came here to fight the American Army. And if you have a musket that's regimentally marked, very likely it was here. And the value is 5 times, or 4 or 5 times a non-regimentally marked piece, because you're almost positive it fought here. So, yes, it's hard. So I collect pieces of the period, like British and French primarily. I have 2 or 3 American pieces documented from here that were made here, but they're few and far between. But I do have British and French muskets and pistols that were produced in the 1750s, 60s, 70s, and there's a very good likelihood they fought here. But am I sure with most of them? No. No one is.
Well, your description of it is making me think now. The black powder and the bullets, were they made here in the continent?
Yes. Yeah, we had black powder. Yeah, because they were hunting. They were protecting themselves from the Indians, and so yes, we had the capacity to, and we had some small independent arms makers. One of my favorite pieces, I have a pistol from 1640, not 1640. The lock plate doesn't say New York City; it says New Amsterdam.
Wow.
That's a very unique piece. But yes, to answer your question, we did make our own bullets. We had the powder. We just didn't have the capacity to produce. There were a couple of small independent gun makers, mostly in Pennsylvania, the Kentucky people that came produce the first Kentucky rifles and Kentucky style pistols. So there was a fair amount of production in Pennsylvania, and a lot of those weapons found their way, but not the vast majority. No, the vast majority of our weapons were imported.
Yeah, well, now that I think about it, I remember a story of you're in Manhattan now, I'm assuming. It looks like you're
Yes, I'm in my office. Just got done.
if you ever got down to Bowling Green Park in Lower Manhattan, there's a park there that is surrounded by a black fence, and um, that's the original fence from when the original Declaration of Independence was read at Federal Hall to the people. And after that reading, a mob of people went down to the park because the top of those fences had crowns on, because the British crown on the top of
Yes.
the finials for the fence, and they sawed them all off and melted them down to make bullets out of them.
Well, that's interesting. I didn't know that.
Yeah, if you
That's
go there
nice.
right now, you could rub your finger on the top of the fence, and it's still rough from where they sawed the crowns off of the top of that fence. So that, to amplify what you were saying, we did make the black. Well, I didn't know about the black powder, but they definitely made the bullets here.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, because that relatively easy. But again, they had to protect themselves from the hostiles, so to speak, the Indians that were hostile to, but also to hunt. They were farmers, they were hunters to provide food for the table. That was the primary reason to have a rifle. Like everybody had a rifle in their house, not only for protection, but to bring food home. And as I say, that's what a lot of our, especially the militia in the Revolutionary War, were armed with, just hunting rifles.
Yeah.
Very long barrel, 50-inch barrels, 55-inch barrels, because they weren't rifled. And the only way it could be accurate was have an extremely long barrel. The
Mm.
longer the barrel, that's not right, a little more accurate. But even with that, the accuracy of these weapons was poor. So a lot of the depictions you see on movies with someone shooting somebody, you know, quarter of a mile away off a hilltop or a tree, just didn't happen. That's why you could have two lines 20, 30 yards apart, firing a couple hundred rounds, like 5 or 6 people. The bullets would just go everywhere. They were not, and not until, and again, that's where the Civil War has one of these dubious honors, the Minet bullet, which was picked up in the rifle. They started to rifle the barrels. And there's a gentleman, Minet, in France, who developed this bullet that had a rim on the back. It picked up the rifling, so it spun, and when it came out, it was deadly accurate. And that's why the casualties, were ridiculously high, because you can't just line up anymore and just fire, because basically whoever fires first is going to wipe out the other side.
Yeah.
And that's one of there's many reasons. Although ironically, the biggest cause of death in the Civil War, as you probably know, was disease.
Yeah.
Not bullets, and there's very little saber fighting. It's very romantic. I love swords, but they were not used extensively in the Civil War. And sickness, diarrhea, the number one cause of death
Yeah.
was
Well,
a GI disturbance.
you take a kid off a farm and then put him in with 600 other guys. All of a sudden, he didn't have the immunity of
Correct.
maybe somebody from New York City or something.
Yeah. And there was no hygiene. That's when, well, the Red Cross came out of the Civil War, and they realized, because in the beginning, they had the hospitals built they used to use farms, and they have the hospital tents on top of manure piles. There was no concept of hygiene and sanitation. And if you were wounded, depending on where the wound was, if you got a belly wound in the Civil War, you were as good as dead. If you got a limb, arm, leg wound, you lose that limb, and hopefully gangrene didn't set in, because you die of infection within 2 days. And the soldiers knew this. They knew that if they were shot in an extremity, they were probably going to lose that extremity. And if they were shot in the gut, they were not going to get out of that hospital. So it must have been not a pleasant place to be. Not as romantic as a lot of these movies make it out to be.
Yeah. Do you collect any medicals, military items?
Yeah, being a doctor, I have a couple of amputation sets that were produced during the period. Not a lot, but I do have a couple of Civil War amputation sets
Mm-hmm.
that were probably used, in the field hospitals.
Do you have
Uh,
an interest in learning the advancements from the medical side as the wars go by?
yeah, I mean, I certainly, uh, have some knowledge of it, and certainly been exposed to it. Um, yeah, again, the big thing was like the surgical techniques, not much different than today. If you look at some of the surgical instruments from 1865 and you look at some of them from 2022, a lot of them look very similar. So the concepts, there wasn't leaps and bounds in change in surgical technique, the actual mechanical techniques. It was the sterilization, and the big thing was antibiotics during World War II. That was a big game changer. And I'm aware of the evolution, but yeah, there wasn't dramatic leaps and bounds as far as surgical technique. Um,
Or the
they,
utensils.
they,
Or the
excuse me?
utensils.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. And so, yeah, I have, I'm aware of it. I don't delve into it too much.
Yeah.
That's why I don't have too many instruments. I have a couple of amputations that look nice on display. Um, but, and again, it's interesting, but it's not my passion. Let's put it that way.
Now, what
Even
would,
though I'm a doctor.
well, I have to ask you, and here I am smiling again, but this is a genuine smile. What would a Civil War soldier do if he needed a tooth pulled?
They have, as I said before, I have Civil War dental instruments.
Hmm.
The forceps used in the Civil War look identical to the forceps used now. Minor changes. So what they would do, well, first of all, they wouldn't be too happy about it, but they had a forceps that they would extract a tooth, probably a little more crudely, I would think, than done today. But the armamentarium or the instruments, not that much different. Uh, they didn't have local anesthesia as we know it, so that was a problem. And not having antibiotics was the real problem. The number of people that died, well, forget the Civil War, up until World War One from tooth infection was astronomical.
Really?
And I don't know what the physics are. Yeah, I don't know what it is offhand. I probably read years ago, but tooth infection was a major cause of death worldwide up until the 20th century because you could not stop a disseminating infection, as we call it. Something that just spread. Yes, you take the tooth out, get the offending agent out, slice somewhere to drain, get some drain. They understood that. You had to drain the infection and try and get rid of this toxin, but they didn't have penicillin until World War II. And a toothache or a tooth abscess could kill you.
Yeah.
So, but on the other hand, they didn't have the diet we had. So they didn't have, it sort of like it limited itself. They didn't have a high uh, sucrose diet. Like they didn't have refined sugars like we know it today. So they, uh, they were spared the amount of tooth decay and that we know today, or it's better now because of fluoride, but that sort of plagued the country later on.
Hmm.
But it's a good point. If you had a toothache, you're in trouble. You had to get a pair of pliers, just rip it out. Give you a couple of shots of scotch and just take it out.
So, you had mentioned in the earlier part of this podcast that you also collect armaments and other militaria from World War II. I'm curious. It seems like I run into a lot of people who share my love for the Civil War, history of the Civil War, and my love of World War II. I sort of have the same insatiable uh, proclivity to learn more about World War II as well. And I kind of skipped World War One and the Spanish American War and anything post World War II. And I'm wondering if you have like an interest in, say, the War of 1812 or the Spanish American War or World War One.
Well, World War One for sure, and I have a number of pieces from World War One. And you think about it, it was 20 years earlier, 30 years or 25 years earlier, and incredible carnage. And again, it was when modern warfare, the weaponry just eclipsed the, how things were before, like the airplane and the toxic gases and the artillery pieces that would just devastating, just
Yeah.
wipe out a whole company of men in one shot. And I'm not sure why it doesn't get the respect of the Civil War, even with myself. Like, I have an interest in it. I have a few pieces from it, um, but I'm not fast, and I'm not sure why. Maybe because we were only there for a year. It was really a stalemate if you look at it. And I've been to the World War One battlefields, which is really impressive, mostly in Belgium. Um, and my grandfather was decorated twice. He was uh, decorated and wounded twice in World War One, and I sort of respect that. And but I just, yeah, I don't know. And most of the country too. Uh, they like I thought in 2014, when it was a 100-year anniversary, there would be this big, uptick in interest in World War One.
Right.
Never really took off. It never did. Spanish American War was too short a conflict. Most people have no idea even the dates of it. You ask a 20-year-old kid nowadays, they would know if it's 1830 or 1896 or whatever. Um, it like didn't it just wasn't a big enough conflict. I
Mhm.
have a few medals. I really don't have. I've got a few. I guess I have a few uh, pieces from the Spanish American War, but um, I don't really have. Again, because it wasn't a prolonged conflict. It never got the attention, even in school. When as we grew up, it was mentioned briefly, but yeah, it didn't, and it hasn't been glamorized like the Civil War and even World War II. Now these movies from World War II, like Midway, and are unbelievable. Because of the graphics and the
Couple of
sensationalism of
a
movies.
couple of years ago, someone came out with it's like a documentary, I guess. It's called "They Shall Not Grow Old," and it's basically speed corrected and colorized World War One film.
Yeah,
And they hired lip readers to try and understand what they were saying while they were being filmed. I don't know if you ever caught that.
no, I've heard of it, but I've never seen it. No.
Yeah, well, I recommend it to you if it's something that comes across your playlist. Definitely give it a
Yeah,
watch.
yeah.
I think you might enjoy it. But you had mentioned you went to some of the World War One battlefields. I'm curious if while you were over there, or maybe on another trip, you visited any of the World War Two battlefields.
Well, I was at Normandy. You
Yes, see,
know,
Normandy has been on my bucket list for 20 years at least.
I was just there just before the pandemic, and always wanted to go. Ironically, my wife had gone 10 years ago with her girlfriend, and they were traveling through France, and they spent. And she said, "You got to go, you got to go." And I went a couple of years ago, and I would love to go back. It was, you know, I know a little bit, obviously, about World War II, but when you spend a week there, and you can spend a week there, a day at the British beaches, a day at the American beaches, go into some of the towns like Caen, it was mind blowing to be like in the bunker that's in that famous scene where the guy turns and the whole American fleet is outside. I was in that bunker,
Oh,
and you
like
realize,
on the longest day.
yeah,
Yeah, I love
it
that
was,
scene. Yeah.
yeah. And I forget the line, he says, famous line, but he turns to talk, and he looks out the bunker, and there's the American fleet out there. And you get to go in there and to be on Omaha Beach, and you see how the 88s were lined up this way along the beach, not out towards the ships. They had every inch of that beach covered, and that's why there was 90% casualties. There was so much firepower on those beaches, millions of rounds, not thousands of rounds, that to this day, and I brought home a couple. Actually, I gave George, our mutual friend, one. You can still pick up stones, rocks that have bullet holes in them from the assault. This is 75 years later. There were so many tens of thousands of rounds in each location that you still can. I brought two or three home, and they have shells in holes, not the shell themselves, but you could see where the bullet hit the rock.
Mhm.
Very impressive to be.
Also
You
see a
go to the
Gettysburg
town.
too, by the way. You can also
I'm
see
sorry.
a few of those at Gettysburg too, by the way,
Yes,
in
yes,
Den area.
and yeah. So it's definitely a bucket list thing to drive through the fields that which I didn't know the extent of how the Germans were smart. They didn't know where they were going to land. They didn't think they were going to land in Normandy, but they flooded every field behind the beaches. So when our paratroopers were dropped in the night before, most of them drowned. They just landed into flooded fields. You know, to see the church, the famous church in St. Anglès from the D-Day movie where the paratrooper was, hit, he's on the steeple hanging over the courtyard. The reality was he landed on the backside of the church. So you find out what really went on, and he survived. He didn't die, but he
Hmm.
didn't. He got hooked on the steeple behind the church so that nobody could see him.
He grew up to be
But little things like what was that?
red buttons.
That's right. So no, you should go. It was you would take these 8-hour tours every day. It wasn't enough. You couldn't. You want to go back and you want to go back. So yeah, they preserved more than I thought. I thought most of it was overgrown or made into tourist attract, condos or beachfront. And there is a lot of beachfront, like even Omaha Beach. But there's enough there that you can appreciate the topography. A lot of the gun emplacements are still there. You could see where the troops landed. Obviously, actually, I waited it out in low tide and turned around and made it back to see what it must have. Well, obviously not what it really felt like, but to realize you didn't have snowball's chance in hell getting to that beach, and because the gun emplacements are still there, and they point out where all the machine guns were and all the 88s were, and never mind the infantry and the fortifications and everything.
Yeah.
Yes, Normandy is definitely something you should do.
It must be sobering to walk through those cemeteries.
It really was. It really was. One of the most moving moments I had was a British cemetery. And, because these are massive. The American cemetery is breathtaking. Sobering is an understatement. But in the British cemetery, I was walking down looking at the tombstones, and there was a photograph, part of this one tombstone. And it was a 19-year-old British soldier who was a paratrooper and jumped with his dog. I don't know how he was able to bring his, but he brought his dog with him. They were both shot down on their way down, and him and his dog are buried together in the cemetery. You see this, and I don't care how tough a guy you are, it brings tears to your eyes. And you see the photograph of him and his dog as they're boarding the plane, and then you're at their gravestone, and they both got shot down and they were buried together. There's like hundreds of these like little scenarios.
Yeah.
Yes, the cemeteries are very moving, and it's part of the whole experience.
Did you
To
get over
see,
did you get over to Pegasus Bridge?
yes,
Huh.
cross Pegasus's bridge, and you you see again. It was at night when those gliders landed, and with how they landed like 10, 15 yards from the gun emplacements because the Germans had on both sides of the bridge, and they didn't hear them land. And they came out and they immediately neutralized the one side of the bridge, and they had to cross to the other side, and they had some casualties. But they have marked, okay, one glider was here, one glider was there. And you're talking about, you know, 10 yard, maybe less. And they were able to go undetected on that one side. Yeah, it's all there, all intact. On the other side is a restaurant that was there during the battle. And actually, I went in and talking to the bar, and I'm looking up, and there was a MG42 relic. It was dug from the battle, German machine gun, above the bar. And I said, I said, look, I have to ask, and I know what you're going to say. That's not for sale, is it? And the guy laughed. He goes, every day, 3 or 4 people, 5 people a day want to buy that. No, it's not for sale. So I might have had a hard time getting it through customs, but you know, but they're still, because they do not, as like in Gettysburg or the Civil War battlefields, you can't do any more relic hunting. You know, it's off limits.
Yeah.
In France and in Belgium, it's open season. You just ask a farmer, because it's still all farmland basically, and can I take my metal detector? And they still dig to this day. When I was there, you know, they helmets, weapons, and there's quite a few being sold in the, lack of a better word, souvenir shops. You could get dug, yeah, because there was so much, again, weaponry that just got dropped, and yeah, they don't care if you take it out, but it was nonstop. Let's say stimulation, you know, to see the stuff you read about and you see, and to be there, to actually be on the sites where it happened, and you could sort of let a better appreciation of how these people had to survive, basically.
Yeah.
And interestingly enough, when I was there, I was at there's a couple of towns that were, quote, liberated first. Well, the Americans claim to have liberated one village first, and of course the British say, no, we liberated the first French town. So that rivalry continued forever, for the rest of the war. But, you know, they left these places, the bullet holes are in the churches, in the buildings, and you get a sense, and you could track how the battles went on.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was there for 5 days, 6 days, and it was only a couple of years ago. And if someone said, you want to take a trip, I'd go back. I'm
Well,
trying to get George to go, but he doesn't
I'm
want to fly.
next to you on the plane, so watch out.
Okay.
You can fix my teeth on the way over there. It's like a 6 hour.
That's right.
I have to ask you, in your collection, do you happen to have a Thompson submachine gun?
No, I don't.
Okay.
Only because, well, for a couple of reasons. The main reason, you cannot own one legally in New York State.
Oh, I didn't even.
Yeah, New York State, that's a class 3 firearm. Yeah, and in New York State, as opposed to New Hampshire, Connecticut, Maine, you could own any, as long as it's registered, you can own anything you want, including machine guns. New York State, you are not allowed, no matter who you are, no matter what license you have, to own a fully automatic, which that is, weapon. So that the answer, no, only because you can't own it. They're expensive. The ones, hey, you can't buy it in New York, but say you lived in New Hampshire and you bought one, if you have it documented, because they were used in World War II quite extensively, they used to be 10,000, they're closer to 25, 30,000 for a documented registered gun.
Yeah.
There's a bunch floating around that are unregistered. The GIs brought the stuff back, and well, I haven't really seen one surface in years, but you really have to just stand. You just can't. I mean, that's major felony. Just like, remember,
my father, who fought in World War II, but he was in mostly in Italy, but he was in the Mediterranean. And in fact, he went into Rome on D-Day because Rome had been liberated, I believe, on the 5th of June.
wow.
And on June 6th, his group went into Rome. But anyway, if you look at his service record, he qualified, I guess, in basic training on the M1. But
Yeah, most people did.
Yeah, he got promoted to sergeant. I guess when he got promoted to sergeant, they gave him the Thompson submachine gun. So I've always been interested in that particular gun.
Yeah. I mean, it's a cool gun. You'd have to move out of state if you want to own one and break open a big piggy bank. Yeah, but any of those fully automatic weapons, you know, just not allowed in New York State. And again, you see them at auction come up, and if they're a class 3 registered firearm, you could sell them. You have to transfer it to yourself. But yeah, it's something which, that's one thing. It would be nice to have. I mean, I'm not wedded to have it, but I also, I guess, know that since I've lived in New York my whole life, it's something which is not on the radar. You know, not allowed to have it. There's a bunch of German machine guns out from World War I and World War II. You always see them come up for auction, but not in New York. You know,
Most of your armaments that you do collect are, uh, would you say black powder rifles?
black powder, percussion, or flintlock, almost all of them. You
Yeah.
know, 98%.
Mhm.
And you don't need any license for any of that. You know, I could sell them in your shop. You know,
I think it's
the
1898, I think is the 1898.
well, it's changed
Okay.
nationally. 1898 or earlier, you don't need registration, no, except in New York State. They have their own laws. They have the Safe Act, which makes nobody safe. But I'm not going to go into the politics of that. It's a feel good BS law. Don't get me started on that. But the laws changed. Um, if it takes a modern cartridge, and a lot of guns in the 1880s, 90s, because after the Civil War, the percussion era ended in 65 and the cartridge era started. So if you have a gun that takes a pistol, rifles are different, but a pistol that takes a modern, if you can get a cartridge, you can buy a, like I had, which I got rid of. It was on my permit. I have a pistol permit, but I had to register it. It was produced in 1859. It's called a Sharps Pepper Box. It's a 4-barrel Derringer. Took a 22 short. Manufactured 1859. When I bought it, I had to put it on my permit because it's not legal to have in New York unless you register it, which no one knows. I don't even think law enforcement knows, but that's the law, and I'm not going to take a chance. And I just didn't feel like having extra guns on my permit, so I sent it up to New Hampshire and they auctioned it off a couple of years ago. But yeah, the 1898 law does not apply to New York State. New York State says if you can get a shell, a cartridge that's readily available, you have, if it's a pistol, you have to register it and put it on your permit. If it's a rifle, you can own it, but you can't sell it casually. Like you used to be able to sell up to 5 years ago. Like if I had a trapdoor Springfield, takes a 4570 or 5070 cartridge. Hey, you say, oh, Tom, you want this? Yeah, fine. Yeah, I'll sell it to you. Can't do that. You could, excuse me, you could do it. You have to go to a FFL dealer that has a storefront, a physical location, and he has to transfer you that gun. So, yeah, New York, and again, no one's robbed a bank with a trapdoor Springfield in a while, but that's New York State and their nonsense laws.
It would
It's
certainly
like,
make the papers if they did.
oh, it'd be in the papers, yeah. But yeah, the 1898 law, to make a long story short, does not apply to residents of New York State. The rest of the country, absolutely, but not here, and probably California too, if I had to guess. The more liberal the state, the more ridiculous the laws are.
Yeah.
We'll leave it at that.
Well, you're definitely a very knowledgeable guy, and I can't believe it's been an hour already, but I could probably go on for 3 hours, but I don't want to hold you up because I know you got somebody in the waiting room waiting to get his tooth pulled.
I'm done. I'm done. I'm
No.
gonna go home, walk my dog, have
Yeah.
some dinner.
Mhm.
But no, I appreciate you having me on. Like you, I could talk about this stuff forever.
Yeah, it was a great honor
It's a
having you.
passion.
Yeah.
It's a real passion of mine, and yeah, it sort of keeps me sane. It's so different than what I do for a living all day. You know, between that and running to keep my head clear, keeps my sanity level
Yeah.
where it should be, I think.
How are things down in New York City? Coming up a little bit? Perking up?
No, it's getting worse. They just published today the statistics, first month in office of our new mayor and DA and police commissioner. Crime is up 60%, 60 in 1 month.
Hmm.
You cannot not arrest criminals. And I don't know what it's going to take to get, well, you need a few more people killed or raped or murdered. I should guess have been killed. But no, seriously, the crime is really a problem here, even on the Upper West Side, in a very gentrified, high retail, real estate, high number real estate. Um, yeah, it's not good. The grab and go stuff where they just walk into stores and grab stuff and walk out. People just let them do it. The police don't even bother, and I don't blame them. Their hands are tied um, because you can arrest between the bail reform, which is another joke, and now this new DA who's The governor, if she had any guts, would replace him, and she has the authority to. You cannot not prosecute crimes. You could, according to him, he's not even prosecuting armed robbery, only if there's a homicide. It's insanity. So to answer your question, no, New York is not in a good place right now. I wish it was. I saw the whole transition from the 70s and 80s, where it was the Wild West down here, to got to be a very safe, great place to live, work, whatever. And we've taken a step back with our last mayor and this guy who talks a good talk, but nothing. Crime's up 60% the first 30 days of this year.
Yeah, that's pretty sobering. I always refer people to an essay that Senator Moynihan wrote, and he's been dead 20 years. It's got, but he wrote an essay called "Defining Deviancy Down," which is, you get the society that you tolerate. Is to boil it down to a nutshell.
That's right.
Yeah. So hopefully it'll turn around.
You reap what you sow. And
yes. And sometimes you have to learn a lesson over again. That's all I can say. And I just hope it turns around soon for you guys down there.
So do I. I mean, because, I have a fondness for the city, even though I don't live in the city, but I've practiced here. Most of my waking hours is here. It's been here for 45 years now, 47 years. And I mean, it will probably turn. It's like it has to get really bad, and then people say they had enough. And I think we're approaching that point. But there's so much politics involved in it, and it's for the wrong reason.
You don't want to be
people get elected for doing.
You don't want to be the guy that's the statistic that turns it around. That's the problem.
That's right.
Yeah.
You don't want to be the guy who knows a person, and that's a problem. And again, my views are not everyone else's, but people get elected by doing the wrong things, and that's what's happening in this country. It has happened recently.
Yeah.
The wrong people are getting elected and getting wealthy at the cost of others. And I think hopefully in the next 12 months we'll see a turnaround.
Oh, your mouth to God's ear, Doctor. I certainly appreciate you coming by tonight. And I know you've had a long day of work, and we appreciate you taking an hour, and especially.
Yeah, it's my pleasure. It's a nice way to end the day.
Yeah, I could talk about, like you said before, I could talk about military history all day. So it was certainly a treat, and we look forward to seeing you soon. Maybe you'll come back and we'll do a political podcast.
Okay. Yeah, I need 2 hours for that.
Thank you, Doctor. You have a great night.
Thank you very much. Thank you for your time and your input. You're setting this whole thing up.
It was my pleasure. Thank you, sir.